All right, welcome to episode, this is 11. So 11 weeks now, Jenna. We have with us Genevieve Vanderlip with, and I should know, it's
Hometown Appraisal.
Hometown Appraisal. And a local Flagstaff appraiser now for how many years going?
11.
Oh, there we go. It's the magic number for today.
Started in 2011. So.
Awesome. And I as we're wrapping up this year, and Jenna, I think I can say some things here as far as like no conflict of interest. Like we love working with Jenna. Our team absolutely loves Jenna. And it's the one thing I always tell real estate agents when we're working with an appraisal, and there's always concern on value, even though this last year has been a rodeo, which we'll get into on that, or the last, 2 years, 3 years. But when people say, okay, can we get a good appraiser? And my response to that is, the appraisers that we work with are good appraisers, and not because the value comes in. It's because they can defend it and they can be professional about it. Is at least the direction we go. So we always feel like we can always get something that you've been thoughtful with and then professionally communicate about. But not a lot of people know that it takes a lot to be an appraiser, and that this isn't just someone shooting from the hip. So for the general public there, walk us through what is that kind of time frame requirement and everything from that standpoint.
Yeah, so being 11 years in, I might not be the best person to ask as far as like what's happening right now.
Sure. Current, but at least what you had to go through.
But it hasn't changed that much as far as I'm still aware. But the biggest thing is there's classes to take where you kind of learn the fundamentals. And then the biggest thing is took me 2 year in mentorship under another appraiser, which is a really kind of a weird setup for any job where, you're trying to find somebody to teach you how to do this job and they don't have a lot of motivation maybe to want to do that. So, because, essentially the first thought is you're training your competition.
Yeah.
And so, but luckily there are people that train and there are people, there's scenarios that fit. So for me, I came in working under Reva Allen at Express Valuation, and she, kind of needed office assistant help. Yeah, and so the trade-off was kind of like, I can help with this clerical stuff while also kind of training. And so, so I was lucky to everything kind of had to align. And I've had people call and ask me, if I would train or if I would, be interested in doing that. And it isn't so much about the competition of things. It's just, there's so much more that kind of factors into that. But it's, so many different things in this world now. Like I work at home. I don't have like an environment maybe that other people have to be able to kind of bring somebody else in into my office setup, So it's not so much about like training the competition, because there's a lot of people that, their goal, maybe they are coming from Phoenix, maybe they're coming from somewhere else. And they don't really have an intention to be in your same market. They just want to get the experience, So there's a lot of different things that can go with that. But that by far is the hardest thing to getting into appraising. But the most important, because what you learn in the books and the classes versus the real life application of what lenders want is really different. So you really need that time to put into to see how it works. And then even after getting licensed, it took me another couple of years to be established with lenders. A lot of lenders have different rules. Like they want you to have 2 or 3 years experience before you can even start appraising on their panel. So it's a long process. There's, unlike maybe some other areas of the real estate industry where you can take your classes and you're kind of more independent and you can just, as long as you do what you need to do, you can start out, hang your license as a real estate agent and just kind of start doing it and learn by the process. And it's just a little harder than that. So it takes a little bit longer. So it's not, a lot of people are like, oh, I maybe look into that part-time or something. I'm like, I don't know how you would do it part-time. It takes a lot. It takes a lot of effort. So, but it's basically, a couple years of studying. And so, once you are a licensed appraiser, it wasn't something that just happened overnight. You were learning that process for years before you really are putting those reports together. So,
which It makes sense on a lot of fronts. In that there is such a big responsibility of just what you do. And then, it's very interesting in the process where I just look at the lending process where we have, I'm reviewing things. I have a team that's reviewing things. I'm a processor and an underwriter, and we have multiple people that's all double checking, rechecking, looking at things. And in your process, it's so critical of what you do because there's not appraisal. Well, there are some appraisal review. I should let everyone know as far as like underwriters are running and looking through things and asking for additional information. So is this kind of lender to appraiser relationship and check on things. But just the sheer impact of the report you put together, what's required, what's not required, the value that comes in has major implications to the transaction. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is there ever so after all that all that training and mentorship and education, everything, do you feel like once you were doing reports on your own, was there's still an intimidation factor on wow, this is big?
Oh, sure.
Has that gone away to some extent, or is it with the moving markets, is that always just still there?
Oh man, I don't know. There's been so many times where I'm just like, oh my God, I feel like it's my first day because you're because like you said, underwriters and reviewers are kind of like all of a sudden, you're kind of doing the same thing. You're going along and then all of a sudden there'll be maybe like a certain thing that kind of pops up that's just like, a privately maintained road. And all of a sudden, you write the same thing all the time and you're researching it and you're reporting it a certain way. And then all of a sudden you just keep getting a rash of revision requests or reviewers saying, talk more about this unmaintained road, and you're just oh man, or somebody will just throw something at you where you're just like, did I not explain that well enough? Did I not, again, is it my first day? But I think that's what I love about appraising is like every scenario, every report is different because it's a different house at a different time in the market with different things going on. That are all factoring in. So it's like appraising is so strange because everybody always says appraising should be objective. Like the comps are what they are. Sure. The value is what it is. You put this mathematical equation together and it is what it is.
Yeah.
But it isn't because it's subjective in that how well do you know the market? How well do you know the comps? We take a neighborhood where you have 20 sales in a year. What of those is your comps? Which 4? So one appraiser might pick a different 4 than you picked for different reasons. And so I think it's such a great job because it just forces you to kind of stay fresh and stay new and stay looking at what's happening. And so with that, some days you're like, oh, do I even know what I'm doing? And then that just is a little more evident with some of these things come up like solar. Solar is just like, you always, it's just changing and you'll be in one market and you can't find anything with solar and you'll be in another market and everybody has solar. And so, again, you're just trying to stay in tune with what's happening, but also that can kind of bring some uncertainty when you go into these areas that are not as conforming, if you will.
Yeah, well, and I've always heard, and early on in my career here in lending and Flagstaff, that appraisals in Northern Arizona are not a science, they're an art form. Mm-hmm. And there's so much to that, and there's just so many different things when it's one of those things where a lot of times, I'd say the majority of times, appraisal goes out, appraisal comes in, it's workable value, and we move on. So not a lot of people understand all that went into it. And I get kind of frustrated, and realtor friends, I love you out there too, but how many even realtor professionals don't understand the appraisal methodologies and even how to look at the report to see where Jenna's head was at, right? That's like step one. Don't just be like, oh, this value is terrible. It's like, no, read the report, understand the adjustments, and understand where this appraiser's head was at to see then if you agree, disagree, or need to have further conversation. But where I want to go with that as well is even on the simple definition of market value, right? That an appraiser's definition of market value versus a realtor's definition of market value are two different things.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, we use Fannie Mae's definition of market value. So,
which is, let's see,
the most probable price that a property should sell for, given all these things: people not being distressed, not being under undue influence. You know, the most probable price. So, you know, maybe in the last year, what we've seen is like an auction mentality. Like, you know, like.
Because that's where I was going to go. Sorry, we'll dive into it, but I was going to say that's where I think most realtors' definitions of market value is what a buyer is willing to pay for it.
Yeah. And what Fannie Mae specifically says is the most probable price for the market. So the market means more than one person. It's multiple people.
Yeah.
So what you can see a lot of times when in the past year would be, you know, we had multiple offers, and usually the highest offer is going to be your contract. Sure. But sometimes when you would take that other additional information of where were all the other offers, and like it got to a point, you know, at the height of the market where you could graph that, and it would be, you know, like plots on a graph where it was just like, well, here's where everybody else kind of is, and that's the market. And then here's this one person that's kind of an outlier. And so that's why, you know, we have multiple comps within a report, because you have multiple things about a property that need to be kind of included in the value, but it also just kind of shows you like, well, you know, if you're basing the value off of one property, then why do you need any other comps? Because, you know, so it's kind of like this pool. And so, you know, not only do they not want just one outlying, you know, what somebody's willing to pay for it, they want that to be proven by showing multiple people did this multiple times with multiple properties, and therefore, you know, this opinion of value. And it's an opinion of market value, meaning based on all this information that I have, based on all these things that sold, all this data, here's what I think that a supported price for this property is, a supported value. And, you know, it's just really hard to do off of one sale or one thing. And it's hard to do off of one buyer, you know, in one situation. So
absolutely. Well, and it even as you're saying that, and it seems very logical, right? But what's so interesting to me is just when emotion gets involved, right? Because you're as far as I can see, appraisal is just trying to be stone cold logic, right? We're not wanting to get emotionally involved in that, you know, that that they love this tile that's in the house, or personal taste or emotional connection, or the pride in their house, to where, you know, a lot of times when we see, you know, communicating with, and I know we all, you know, people get tied up and they want to, realtors want to represent their buyer or seller to the best of their ability. And sometimes they look at that, or even, you know, even friends of mine that talk, it's like, oh, someone sold for this, and that's could be an outlier, but that justifies theirs, right? Or they emotionally get connected to, like, my house is even better. And so there's so much emotion in that value piece that you just have to strip out, and it can be quite difficult.
Well, and I think a well-supported appraisal usually should have those elements, you know, it's better, mine's the best, there's never been a house like that. And it's the job of the appraiser to say, well, no, sure, here's all these houses that are, you know, inferior or not as good. We use the word good, but and the way that an appraiser can say where, you know, figure out where the value kind of lies is by always having something on both sides. So you have to have something better, and you have to have something not as good.
Inferior,
And, you know, so I use the term superior and inferior, because, you know, use like good or bad, or, you know, but the way that you can prove, you know, so for example, if a house goes under contract and it's $500,000, and, you know, everybody's thinking it's worth that, and, you know, you're kind of working through it, and you're like, but, you know, it doesn't have this, doesn't have that, it's not as big, it's not in this location. The way that you kind of show that value is, well, here's a house that sold for $550 and has all these things going for it, and here's a house that sold for $450, and, you know, it's not that far off from where you're 500, you know, so then it's just kind of like, that's how the comps kind of show you, you know, like, you know, it isn't just my house is the best house. You know, you always kind of have to have that thing on the other end that says, well, here's where the really, you know, where the really good house is. And then you kind of fall somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the biggest difference between what an appraiser is doing and maybe like an automated valuation, because automated valuations are going to take just purely like mathematical data and boil that down into here's what your house is worth. But it's based on so many different things that are just, you know, the size, the bedroom, bathroom count, the zip code it's in. And that's how they come, you know, justify location.
Yeah.
You know,
exactly.
But an appraiser like, okay, well, you know, we're in 86005. That's not all apples to apples, you know? So that's kind of where, you know, a well-supported appraiser is always going to use things on both sides. And that's where you're going to be able to kind of prove that opinion of value, not just, you know, pull it from something. And it's not just your opinion. It is a methodology, because the biggest thing about, you know, there's tons of factors that kind of go into the methodology of appraising, but it basically is reasonable replacements and the principle of substitution. So, you know, a lender wants to see, or an underwriter wants to see, well, if you're going to buy this house, why wouldn't you go buy this other house that's basically equal, that's less?
Yeah.
You know, and so, and that's where the appraiser comes and goes, well, they're not equal. It's because this one has this location, or it has these other factors. And here's some comps that kind of show both sides. And so that's the biggest thing for anybody that's looking at an appraisal is hopefully the appraiser can communicate that the comps, the combination of the comps in the report are painting a picture of here's what you can get for less, here's what you can get for more. This is what those ones for less didn't have. This is what the ones for more did have. And we're meeting somewhere kind of in the middle.
Yeah. No, there's so many ideas firing right now that there's just so much to unpack here, because you made a great comment about automated valuations, right? And I think that blends itself into just knowing that, sure, like anything, free information can be helpful as long as you recognize its shortcomings. And so when it comes then to the market right now, there's a lot of things like instantly firing off into so many conversations I had. And how does this work and accommodate, right? Because we know that, you know, lenders want an appraisal because we want to know our loan to value position. We want to know that there's some skin in the game, so that there's some mutual, you know, everything's a risk assessment, right? So of course you know this, but just the general public and kind of knowing that, hey, appraisals are very, very important to us. And then when we look in these shifting markets, there's a lot of different factors that make your job and a buyer's position and seller's position quite strained and difficult. You know, in a perfect world, I just see like little movement in rates, right? You know, not big shifts or massive, like, hey, the same rate you got quoted 6 months ago is pretty similar to today. And that's not the case. And I think that's, you know, I probably would, is that a safe assumption? Like you'd like to see, hey, little changes in value, like little ups, you know, versus we've seen we're seeing some bigger swings here. Yeah.
I mean, it's just really hard because like we were talking about the emotional side of everything, you know, in the peak when people were, you know, they've missed out on 3 houses and this is where all the other offers were. And, you know, and there is that factor of, you know, that the property should be worth what somebody's willing to pay. What buyer and seller have agreed upon. You're willing to sell for this. You're willing to buy for this. But then again, the lender just, they don't want just that because the contract shows that, you know, like, so they want the proof in there that, like, again, other people are kind of having the same mentality. So when these big shifts happen, like we're seeing right now, you know, there's comps for days that support the value. But then how then does an appraiser go, okay, well, here's all these comps. They all sold much higher. And now here we are. And this contract is much lower. Now we're in this stage of like, oh my gosh, the comps are kind of supporting a higher value. But then we have this contract that's not, that shows that negotiations that, you know, people aren't willing to pay as much. People aren't able to sell as high.
House was sitting for a while.
And so we're going this opposite direction where the comps are still supportive of maybe a higher value. But you can't ignore the fact that the houses are sitting longer. They're not going for full price, you know, full list price. They're getting negotiated down. There's bigger concessions. So it's, yeah, I mean, and so as an appraiser, you know, you're always kind of looking at those are the things that are happening in the market that you have to kind of factor in and look at and try to figure out what to do with that information. You know,
how can you factor that in though? And I know, you know, to help people understand that, and I should you more explain these things, but going from the logical standpoint that when you say comps and comparable sales, to support, hey, what is the value doing? And it's, you know, relatively easy, I should say, if values are stable, to be able to look what sold in the last 3 months in similar neighborhood and bracket, right? The lower and higher. Am I using that word right? Bracket the subject property. But when we see that, yeah, that's easy, right? And you can pull up the comps that have sold recently, relatively recently. I get this will be interesting as we go on through the year, how recently some of these sales will be. But how then mathematically can you, that puts a lot of weight on you to try and say like, oh, based on, is there some type of standardization on the equation? I'm saying how long did the property sit? How many offers are in? Because you were trying to do that the other direction, right? And saying, okay, the last house sold for $50,000 less, but that was a month ago, and now they got 10 offers, right? How do you do that?
So the best way, or I would say, you know, how I feel is the best way to kind of look at the scenario is always using the most recent comps, because that's what's happening in more recent time than what happened even 2 and 3 months ago.
Yeah.
So you look at your most recent sales. You look at mathematical statistics of what's happening in the neighborhood. So, you know, there was a time where I was looking year over year, this year versus last year, increase. And we were seeing these huge increases, 20% in a neighborhood, you know, so year over year.
Yeah.
And now, you know, I'm like, okay, well, I have to kind of change the data I'm looking at to maybe not go year over year. We're going 6 months to 6 months. And that's where you're seeing stabilization, because still year over year, probably showing a bit of an increase. But once you get into these shorter time frames of what's happening right now, so again, most recent comps, most recent months, then you're really starting to kind of see like, oh, things that have stabilized. I wouldn't go as far as to say that I've seen a real decline yet. But when you do start seeing that, then, you know, you're looking at basically, you know, it's basically called a time adjustment. So, you know, what happened 3 months ago, 6 months ago, we're seeing this rate of decline, and then you apply a mathematical adjustment basically to say, you know, this house that sold 6 months ago wouldn't have sold for that now. So I'm going to do a rate of decline, and you basically apply an adjustment for time. Yeah. And so it works in the opposite when things are going up. You know, if you're using a comp that's 6 months old, maybe you're using it because it has very specific things that bracket. You know, it has the same location or it's the same size or, and so if that sold 6 months ago and we've increased, you're taking this rate of increase that you can prove. And I think right now the hardest thing is we all kind of can feel this shift in the market, but mathematically it's a little hard still to apply a number. You know, so that's where you're looking at the most recent sales. And then the other thing that appraisers do is when you are coming up with that final opinion of value, you have, you know, 4 or 5 comps in a report, you've adjusted them all out, and you have these adjusted sale prices. Then you're coming up with that opinion of value that should fall in between those prices. So that's kind of your range. And then you are giving it a weighted value. Yeah. So again, as an appraiser, looking at all these things, like how long have the houses sat on the market, like what's kind of happening with these statistics, then you can kind of, you know, the methodology for me is to give the most weight to the properties and the comps that I feel best reflect what's happening now. So then you can kind of say, well, whether that was because it was the most recent sale, because it's the most similar property, maybe I use a combination of that and I say, well, I'm going to give most weight to these two because this one's super recent, this one's the most similar house, and then that's where I kind of come up with my final opinion of value. So it really is kind of just making sure that you're attuned to, you know, well, this house is the most similar, so I'm going to go give most weight to that because that's what I always do.
Yeah.
It's trying not to get stuck in that. This is what I always do. Like maybe there was a time where it was, the most similar house. Now it's the most recent activity. And that's where you're going to shift kind of your thinking and make your opinion of value kind of fall more in line with that.
And with that, the mechanics of it, is it something where you'd say on the way up with rapidly increasing values, and this is just where my mind's going, so let me know how you feel about it, is that when we're going up, there's a sense of appraisal lag to some extent, right? If the market's going rapid and appraisers are doing their best to adjust for it, but just like we saw in the last 2 years of a lot of people paying above appraisal because the appraiser couldn't justify that, but at the same time there was number 2 contract in place ready to take that house from you. Mm-hmm. And we did see, when you talk about the outliers, like we did see, that's then not indicative of overall market value. And we did see some people just say, hey, I'm done. I'm fine spending technically overpaying if that's exactly what it is for this house, just because I want to be done searching, and I'm okay knowing that I could be potentially underwater instantly on this house. And that doesn't mean that that's really the overall prevalent market value of the house. So on the way up, there's this lag. On the way down, which I would say, in my eyes, is the lender then that kind of more conservative and protective, right? Of saying, hey, you're going to have to overpay for this house. The appraiser's going to come out with a more conservative value. But on this, and we don't know, and so we should be careful there. We don't know where this is going. And I think it's very, the point you make on year over year versus month over month, people need to understand that very, very closely. Not a lot of people buy a house 1 month and sell it a couple months later. That's not very smart to do on a house, a stock, anything, right? But knowing that, okay, so month to month we're seeing things slowing, right? Is that going to lead to overall more significant like year over year decline? Like who knows? We're just going to have to fill that out. And it's, where there's a seasonality to it right now that we just haven't experienced just with 2% rates that usually Flagstaff slows down. People enjoy the holidays and this, they don't love looking at homes under snow, right? But I guess what do you think that we'll see? I guess what are the as to a buyer in this market? Let's talk more about the buyer. What are the things that they should kind of know on that appraisal right now? Is saying, hey, that might be more optimistic. Is that a potential risk right now? Is that the appraisers could be more optimistic than they could negotiate on the house?
I mean, I think that we are seeing more, a little bit of a better scenario for buyers because I think that the sellers that are in the market right now are kind of doing what everybody's doing, which is maybe being a little slow to get on the train of what's happening and where this is going. And so you're seeing a lot of price reductions and you're seeing a lot of people that, again, we talk about the market value being undue stimulus, not being under that. And there's a lot of people that are in a lot of situations where they've already moved out of a house and they're making more, extra payments that they don't want to do. And so they're willing to drop the price or they're willing to negotiate or they're willing to do these things. And so, but that's kind of interesting because that's happening all the time, but I feel like where we're coming off of, just this feeding frenzy and overbidding and things like that, it's drastically shifted and it's in a position now where you're kind of almost seeing like so quickly the pendulum swing back to where now all these sellers are kind of like, oh man, I need to get this house sold. And so, you're seeing these buyers that are able to, kind of negotiate and take their time and actually maybe even care about an appraisal again and making sure that it's going to appraise. And again, we're not really seeing that's hard to do, because it's again, talking about the lag time, it's slower activity and it's not as many comps that are more recent to choose from. And so, the value part, I think, people are probably pretty good right now in terms of if they're concerned about the value. I think that, probably an underlying thought that's going on for people right now is like, if we're starting this decline, like how far down is it going to go?
Yeah.
And so that could be like, kind of hesitant for people too, because the seller's motivated by that. But also I think the buyers are kind of interested to see like, well, I wait a little bit. But Flagstaff's strange because you still at any given time don't have a lot of inventory. And so I think, that's a factor always. And so you still don't see things sit for a terribly long time. But you can see these trends. You can see, as soon as interest rates or perceived interest rates, right? Because, the Fed, when they say, oh, the Fed raised the rates, it's like, well, how does that translate to what the rates are for houses, and you're way better equipped to explain that to people. But, when you hear the news or you have these conversations that are happening and how that does, then you do see like a pump of the brakes and you see people kind of pause and, but then, it's happening on both sides. So again, you're seeing the sellers. And I've had to make a few calls in the last couple of months where I'm like, this just doesn't seem right. Is there something I'm missing? Is there a factor for this seller that, they're willing to take this price? Because obviously the comps are just, they're not there. And every single time, yes, they've moved. They can't afford this house anymore with another mortgage payment. They are getting a divorce. They can't, they need this house sold so they can buy their house, so those factors are always happening in our market. And now I think that it's definitely a benefit to the buyer. We're back into like a buyer having kind of the upper hand. So,
yeah. And I think that becomes those two factors, right? That it just blows my mind how separate they can be, right? In the sense of when you're saying the two factors of market value that we're defining here, in that what someone technically could sell a house for with prevailing multiple people. I love the multiple people interested based on multiple houses and, really stacking and layering that data up. But then knowing that on a case by case basis. And that's where I think I'm kind of excited for the professionals to get back in the room here, in the sense of, I think a lot of things were just so fast and loose, even solid, decade-long professionals here in Flagstaff were struggling trying to deal with real estate professionals, just how to advise and how to accommodate and how to, manage the risk and have best outcomes. And so I just think it's very exciting to me as things slow down. I think that's the biggest time factor, that everything is going to be case by case, and what someone was willing to take an offer on is really right now, just with this slower market, is more so not so much based on what they could, based on where that person's at and what they need.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting with appraisal too, because appraisals are historical. They're based on what's already happened.
Yeah.
So when you were looking at some of those things of like, where do you factor in all these bids? Where do you factor in that, all these things are happening in kind of real time and they've lost out, and so it's kind of interesting then, because appraisers are looking a lot at like listings, like pending sales. And those don't get factored into the opinion value because they're still theoretical. Like anything could happen. They could fall out. So you can't put a lot of weight into those, and you can't include them in your opinion of value. But they're a great tool to kind of look at what's actually happening right now. And one of those things that, that was like really helping things when the market was increasing, because more things were coming up and everything was higher, because, they're seeing what's happening and what's selling and what's pending. Sure. And so they're going above and beyond that. And then, again, it kind of works conversely when you see the market right now kind of slowing down, but still those listings, because, those are your competition. That's what you're up against. Yeah. And so when different sellers in the market have different motivations, and their agent comes into them and says, okay, well, I feel like agents are really well-versed in listings. A lot of times when I go to appraise a house and an agent says, oh, I give you some comps.
Yeah.
Great. Because I'll look at what, you guys are working with the public. You're working with the market. You're working with the buyers and sellers. So giving me that information as to what you think a comp is great to know. and they're always listings. And it's like, okay, well, not completely.
Big asterisk for agents listening to this.
But
not to do.
Again, because, a comp, we wouldn't call those comps. Those are, again, they're still theoretical. But, again, still valuable information because it's like, oh, I can see that you're looking at what is competing with this house. And so that really is good information. And so I think what we're seeing now is the listings that are coming up on the market are kind of driving people's price reductions, because you might be the first one out and you've been on the market 20 days and you haven't moved. And then someone else comes in with another house and it's lower. And all of a sudden, you see that one go pending right away. And that kind of maybe says, like I had this, not a personal scenario, but in my neighborhood, I saw, a house sell and, went a little bit above asking. And then 3 weeks later, another house goes on the market and it's a little bit lower. And I'm like, that's weird. Like, you're not even going to try for the same, or, they're very identical houses. And it was just like, okay. But, maybe motivated, moving van out front, they've already moved out. They don't want to go, they want to go slightly under what the comps are at so that they can move it. And in that time frame, though, here comes a couple more listings on the market, and they're even lower. And again, what are those sellers' motivations? And so it's really kind of interesting with listings and pending sales, because they kind of help drive the market. They kind of help, they kind of paint that picture of like what's happening in real time versus comps, and things that have already sold. So maybe, again, kind of going back to where like, sure, maybe the comps support the value all day long, but then these listings are kind of coming in and they're showing you kind of where things are going. And so I think if buyers in the market are more attuned to, what else is available, what's available to you right now, or what's available to you in a couple of weeks. And that's the thing with the real estate market, that like appraisers have to learn this whole method of exposure time, which is the reasonable amount of time that a house should be on the market to have enough potential buyers kind of filter through and be able to consider it and then make their decision. And we say, in Flagstaff, I don't know if that's ever been higher than 4 months, Oh,
wow, yeah.
But in the mind of like the general public, it should be 2 weeks. Like if your house goes on the market and you don't have a full offer in 2 weeks, like what's wrong with it, And so it's kind of interesting because you don't really see that patience like playing out, and they didn't have the opportunity to do that. Buyers didn't have the opportunity to let me think about that one for a couple of weeks. Everything's immediate, and so I think right now what we're kind of seeing is if you kind of take that time to see what's coming up in the market in 20 days, a month, you'll see that, everything's kind of shifting in that kind of downward direction because of whatever's motivating people.
Yeah. And it's fascinating, that aspect of time, and then and that perception of normalcy or normal, right? And just knowing that, when you said you were leading up to that, I was like, what is she going to say? What's the number? Like 4 months. You're like, oh my gosh. Like, when was the last time that someone wanted their house listed for 4 months?
Right.
And a great buddy of mine, and he's a developer, right? And so he knows this game, and he built a house here in Flagstaff, and then his family decided they need to make some shifts and some moves, and he had it with 2 different agents, and he was wanting to get it moved pretty quick, and had it with 2 different agents, and finally got it sold. And I think it was on the market probably pretty close to like 3, maybe just over 3 months. And this was just before 2020. Yeah. And so not only do you have to laugh in a couple of ways of like, and his wife just gives the hardest time that like, had we just held on to that property for 6 to 8 months, could have been a couple extra $100,000 in the bank.
Yeah.
So not even people attuned to market, but just in that exposure time that, after 2 months did he, start to get impatient.
Right.
And so when you said 4 months, and then in many situations that 24 to 48 hours was all it took to have an offer in hand and negotiated. And so just knowing, and I think culturally, so many different things in our lives and technology do lend themselves to instant gratification. And then all of a sudden but probably is, hopefully a limited period of time, people got that in the housing market that, you could buy and sell and do all this so quickly that's that factor of time. I think I'm fascinated to see how that shifts value, because if people get impatient and then they lower their values and then it becomes a new norm. So just because of the emotional response to time could be very interesting.
And then we're all kind of like sheep, so we kind of follow and
everyone,
the person did. But it's also like, if you look at that reasonable exposure time, the higher the price of the house, the higher the value of the house, the longer the exposure time.
Sure.
Because there's not as many people in that market.
Sure.
But also a more interesting market where you see more patience, and you see that it isn't unreasonable to think that if you have, these properties that are millions of dollars, that they're going to take longer to be exposed to the buyers in that market, and then they go for cash.
Yeah.
So it's like, and so my point to saying, and then they go for cash is like, and then someone goes, yep, that's the house, and I have the money, and I'm going to pay it, and here you go. And so then it's like, and so you see that play out in kind of these different markets where you would kind of think that, and it's more accepted. It's just like a more reasonable way to think. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with the house by any means. It's a $2 million house. So there's nothing. They just don't get as stigmatized. That because people kind of just expect it. Like, well, of course that house didn't sell overnight. It's $2 million. And so, we don't apply that to the same, the same methodology, because it is a more competitive market. So of course you do have to be more, you might have to move a little quicker.
Sure.
So maybe you don't have 4 months, but again, in Flagstaff, but I am starting to see that now where I'm like, 6 months ago, 1 to 2 months. That was our exposure time. Like, and it was rarely even a month, you could have a transaction done in the month, but those times are getting a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer, but the patience of people is getting a little shorter and a little shorter. Yeah. And so they never seem to quite line up.
No. And I think it's so valuable, and just exactly what you're saying, for people to be able to understand the numbers, right? And it's really unfortunate that I think the media can be very disingenuous with, their clickbait out there and things. And even in a statistic I saw from a friend of mine that said, the median home price has come down by like 16%. And so, but that to me says exactly what you were saying, is that $1 million home is not selling anymore. And those were skewing that median or average all day long, right? And to say, okay, now they're more patient and that's not selling. So actually what's selling is the median home price is 16% lower. That does not mean that we have a 16% reduction in price. Right. Yet some people might correlate that in their minds, not understanding how the mathematical function of an average or median.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's interesting too, though, because it's, just going back to what you were saying about like the news, and I had a long time ago quit all my news that's catered to me, comes in because they're reading all my appraisal emails and they're like, wow, this girl's really interested in the housing market, and so I get all the emails, that's and if I read every one of those, it's like I wouldn't have a job. They doomed my job a long time ago and my relevance, and and so I had to quit reading them. Yeah, because I'm just like, okay, this is gonna. It's kind of like the misery doesn't love company. Like as the market slows down, I don't need 14 news articles telling me that the market's slowing down. But the average and median, kind of what you were saying, that's always been an appraiser. It's so hard. It's so hard for people to, because kind of we're going back to well, is your house the average house? So are you fine settling with that average value or the median value? Because, so many times, anybody's house doesn't fit within that parameter. They're either the above average house or they're the below average house. And so, it is kind of interesting, but I don't know. I think that, unfortunately, the way that the housing market has gone, and I like in my job, when I'm in people's houses and I'm talking to them and they're like, what could increase my value? You know, like, what should I do to increase the value of my home? Should it be the kitchen? Should it be the, you know, and it's like, it always kind of comes back to, well, you have to do what you want to do for you. Like, this is your house. Sure. And it's maybe your biggest asset, but it's your home, you know, and like, what are you going to do with it? And what do you want to do with it? And so I kind of just bring that point up because we're talking about the patience in the market. How many people in the market say, you know, maybe it's time for us to move and we'll just sit here for a few months and let people come into our house every day and do showings for 3 months. And that sounds like a totally reasonable time frame, 3 months of showings, but, and so it's not a big mystery as to why we have a lack of patience for the process of, buying and selling houses, because it's just, it is emotional. It's always emotional, and there's so many factors. And so I think like maybe part of the flaw of that, reasonable exposure time is, just looking more at like, the numbers of things and less at the fact that there's people tied to these scenarios, and like not everybody has, kind of going back to that, maybe second home, $1 million home market where you're not using that house maybe half the year or something. So you can let it sit on the market for 6 months and see what happens. But for the reality, like not a lot of people have that opportunity to do that. And so I think that leads to some of the impatience and ness in the market. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I guess if you, to speak towards that relevance piece, so you just had touched on that, and I was going to ask on that as well. I have my own, I get put in the same category, or lending gets put in the same category all the time. I think there was an Oxford study like 10 years ago that had a list of like 1,000 professions and said who is most likely to be automated, like from 1 being least likely to 1,000 being most likely. And like real estate profession, like realtor and loan officer, they were like in the 900s or something, just like very extremely likely to be replaced by automation and everything. And yeah, sure. Like, come on, take my job computer and like, I'm like, great. The future will be here eventually. But I have my own opinions on why that hasn't happened to my particular profession. So I'm curious to see what you see as the future of appraising and how technology is going to change that for you.
Well, I think that it's definitely concerning the amount of shift in things that you see happening with what they'll allow, for Fannie Mae appraisal waivers, so right there, they look at automated value. They look at, different factors of the borrower. Yep.
Risk factors.
And then, again, all about risk. And then they make this decision whether or not you even need an appraisal. And then so we've seen a ton of that. And so a lot of my business has gone from the fact that people don't need, quote, need an appraisal.
Sure.
And so that's interesting, so you're always like, okay, well, we'll see how that comes back around, when that didn't work out so well, or, if it will. And so that's kind of like, we're definitely seeing that move in the market where, a lot of people don't even need an appraisal. What I find really interesting is where the bulk of my business has gone since the slowdown, since August, is FHA and jumbo. And so 2 really far ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's interesting.
FHA, thank you. FHA does not allow for appraisal waivers. So, there, and so when you think about FHA, and again, you're better versed to educate people on what FHA brings to the table, but, they're still, wanting that appraisal, wanting that information in their file and assessing that risk. And FHA is also very big on, making sure properties conform. And I think that that's kind of why appraisers are still out there, is because we are the eyes and ears for the bank. So we can walk in a house and say, you don't have a stair railing. You're going to, this is a health and safety issue. Which kind of puts the occupants at risk, and then the fallout from there, if something were to happen. the zoning issues, the legality issues, people putting illegal guest quarters on their property and then wanting to get a loan on it, and having that kind of again, we're all assessing risk, and the appraiser checking that box that says, no, this property does not conform to the zoning. You could not rebuild it if destroyed. That's been an interesting factor in our market lately. Absolutely, the fact that we're seeing real life properties being destroyed that need to be rebuilt, and maybe had mortgages on them, had homeowner insurance on them, that are all looking to the appraiser to be like, did you appraise this right? Did you call out the zoning correctly? So there's all these factors that, you kind of, you can kind of see when those scenarios come up where you're at a property that has an illegal issue or has a health and safety issue. And so I think that luckily, there's been a lot of ways in this last year. It's been crazy to see the technology that's come out where they want to, and all in the motivation is to get the appraisals done faster. So instead of having the appraiser go out to the house, they want you to like Zoom with the homeowner and have them be on their phone, and you basically FaceTime them and they show you around their house and you make your assessment.
Really?
Yeah, and a lot of these desktop
is that more,
products,
and that's more of a speed focus versus is also motivated by the pandemic factors somewhat.
I think that's maybe what tipped it off, and people kind of got this idea of how do we keep the appraiser out of the house. What also has been a huge driving factor is discrimination cases, where if you actually remove the appraiser from the house, they never went there, they don't know who the occupants are, that you can limit, kind of this unfair bias and discrimination practices that are happening. Now, we could do a whole nother podcast on that part of what's happening in appraising with fair housing and discrimination. But so I think that a lot of it, they're trying to get to these technologies. They're trying to kind of shortcut the appraisal process by getting things faster because, anytime the human is involved and we have to schedule and you can only do so many appraisals a day and you can't get them out fast enough and there's not enough appraisers and, except for no one's going to tell you that right now, so it's kind of like, it's all like, we gotta bear the brunt of like, the appraisal process. Like if we went away, it would make everything so much more streamlined, but there is this reason that we're there. And a lot of it, I think, kind of falls to being able to actually see these properties. And some of the things that they've put in place with the technology, I think, are going to go in a direction that could make it better. But I don't know better for who. I don't want to say to a homeowner, like, so could you just point your camera up there so I see some mold? And is that what you have going? There's a real human element to the fact that when you're in a house, you're observing things, you're seeing things, and those are factoring in to, and some of them are really important. Some of them are just you taking stock of the property. And so do you need to be in a house to be able to get a full, clear picture of that house? Maybe not. That's probably property specific. If I'm doing, a 3-year-old condo, do I need to, make sure that I'm going in there, make sure there's no issues? But we don't live in that world. We're really unconforming market. So some of these technology things that you're seeing kind of drive like replacing appraisers. Another big thing that happened this year was like having other individuals. I don't know, like property inspectors, let's say they would call them, where they would actually go out and do the physical inspection of the property. So maybe they measure it. They would take photos. They would sketch the house out. Fannie Mae has a rule that if you're going to do a desktop appraisal, you still have to have a sketch of the house. So they're having this third party go out and do essentially what the appraiser was doing and then giving that information to the appraiser. But there's been a huge pushback from the appraisal industry because why not just have me go out? Like, what time are we saving to have this third party come out and they do it? But maybe that person's not tied up with actual appraising, so they're able to go do 4 inspections a day of a house, and send that data over. Yeah. So then again, the liability comes to the appraiser, where I'm the one that's taking this information, basing my opinion of value that I'm then liable for on this third party's data. So you've seen a huge pushback. Like, people are not comfortable with that.
Yeah.
The time saving thing is kind of questionable. And so we'll kind of see where that goes.
Yeah.
Because again, it's like, I've even like heard it, in our industry too, of like copywriting sketches, like you can't take a sketch from the builder and use that in your report. And so there's all these like interesting factors that are things that we don't even know about that are going to come up, I think, to say whether or not we could really be doing this. But, so again, technology, I think they haven't quite figured out how to replace a person being in the house, seeing the house, seeing the condition that it's in, seeing health and safety issues, which then, are a small part of assessing that risk, because they don't want to lend on houses that aren't safe, aren't secure, have deferred maintenance. So I think that, that factor is kind of keeping us relevant.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that it's very, very fascinating to me. And I love the hindsight 2020 when we look back at certain things. And here we are as an industry trying to solve all these different problems that, if it's, in this whole, like, the Arizona Association of Realtors draft this whole additional clause addendum based on the market conditions that existed for about 24 months. Yeah. And that no one's using that addendum right now.
The shortfall with the appraiser.
Yeah, so it had like shortfall and escalation clauses. Mm-hmm. So for those that weren't familiar with it, and just how we can basically turn some of the process into a bit of an auction house and like different things that waived a lot of buyers' rights that traditionally would be very, very ill-advised. Or I think most real estate agents with their licensure would say that those are ill-advised. And so here we are then with, that's what I think is very interesting about the appraisal industry or other factors of the real estate industry in general, where we're trying to solve some things in a vacuum, but don't understand that there is, and just call me trying to defend my job here, but that there is some valid way of why we've set this up a certain way and why it just works this way. And it reminds me of when you were talking about like having someone show you, like, are they going to really be fully disclosed? And like, let's show you the smaller piece of the mold or water damage on the ceiling kind of thing. Whereas, when you go and do that little Google security check, you're having to click like, which are the images of like, how long is it going to take Google to recognize and know those things that you as a human trained with thousands of hours, right? Once you get through mentorship and education, everything, to be able to then do that and defend and protect the value for the client and for the lender. Right. I don't know.
And again, it's interesting to me that the people or the areas of the lending business that still place a relevance on that are FHA and jumbo, because jumbo, not so much maybe for being out of the house and seeing, health and safety, things like that, but jumbo being actual, not these kind of like wide range automated things, they don't want an automated value once the loan amount gets to a certain amount where they feel is a little more risky. Yeah. Not only do they require an appraisal, sometimes they require two. Yeah.
And oftentimes appraisal reviews, like 80% of the jumbo appraisals, we're seeing appraisal reviews. So a second opinion coming in. Right.
And so it's really kind of interesting that these areas of the market that, kind of the two different extremes are the ones that are still kind of placing an importance on that and placing relevance on it. And so I think that that's kind of telling that, of like maybe, I don't know, like where we're going, but it'll be kind of interesting to see, where that kind of goes with these appraisal waivers. And again, it's all like hindsight, like when the housing market in, 08, 09 happened, like, they kind of, again, created more forms and they wanted more data and they want more statistics because they want, like as much information as they can to go into that appraisal. And so I think it'll be kind of interesting to see kind of what happens, because the appraisal waiver has been in place for a long time, but we've always been kind of on this upward swing. And so, we'll see what happens.
Well, and I think it's important for people to know, and when we are getting those, that it was fairly common on a high equity rate term, so not cash out, rate term refinance. We saw a lot of those, and maybe makes some sense, right? Because I love that VA, right? When we talk about government and stuff, and VA allows for no appraisal rate term refinance, which I kind of appreciate that logic in the sense of saying, hey, if you're on the hook for this loan anyways, and we're just going to improve your ability because rates have come down and we're going to improve your ability to pay this, that we're not really going to need to reevaluate the property.
Sure.
Because what are we going to do anyways? Oh, the property is losing value and we're going to keep you in this higher rate, right? You know what I'm saying? And so that made sense to me. And we saw them on very little purchases and still see them on very little purchases. And usually only when it's like, hey, we're putting a chunk of change down and probably lining. It's a black box. We don't know exactly all the parameters, but I'd assume probably in line with them assessing there's some stability to value, right? But yeah, I think a lot of these things, I think technology will, and all these great ideas will start to take a back seat when it's like, oh no. Like, and you see that with all these iBuyer platforms, right? They worked off of that. I don't know if you follow that much. I know you said you don't kick into the news as much anymore, and I try and stay aloof on some of it.
I still try to say, I go to where the resources are and where the real conversations are happening, not so much kind of these broad things. So
yeah. And the clickbait and knowing that, here are all these, you know, when it's just seems like, oh, real estate can only go up, and then all these iBuyers are entering the market, doing their quick evaluations, purchasing homes, thinking that they'll go ahead and sell them for a thicker margin, and they're taking advantage of the time factor. That was one of their biggest things, that they'll say, hey, you need to sell now. We'll go ahead and buy the house now. And so you'll sell it for a little bit less, and then we'll sell it for quite a bit more. And those, many of those failing, you know, flat out just trying to liquidate their inventories right now, just because that automated and thought process of, oh, it's always going to go up doesn't always, yeah.
Well, and like from my perspective, one of the biggest things seeing that was, like, you know, if I can say actual name of Zillow on this podcast, but Zillow, and how many people look at Zillow and how many people use that as a tool, and you would put in an address and the first thing that would come up is, we'll buy your house. And I'm like, I'm not going to offer to buy your house. So, you know, in terms of, you know, a trusted source, right? Yeah. Like, so.
Oh, there's so much in the industry when that was happening. Like, is this a conflict of interest if they're telling you what your house is worth and they'll tell you, oh, I'll buy it.
And they'll finance it for you.
And they'll finance it too.
Home loans. So it's like, that's, you know, it is kind of interesting though that, where, like, how much of those type of entities were able to drive the market, drive the prices up, and be competing with these, you know, buyers in the market. And then now it's like, Zillow's not offering to buy your house anymore.
Thank goodness.
You know, and, so I mean, it's interesting, but I always would I got to a place, because it's very common practice for somebody to ask me, you know, how is your value going to compare to Zillow? You know, because they just want to know, and it's this source for them that, you know, kind of gives them some information. And, you know, every time the first thing I would say is, you know, you just have to consider the source. Like, you know, I think that there is some amount of automation. We're statistic driven, you know, data driven kind of profession. And so there is maybe some rhyme or reason to that. But you just kind of have to,
the source and
consider
motivation,
whatever else, that is that they have for the market and what their influence is on it. But
well, awesome, Jenna. Well, this has been there's just a wealth of knowledge on it, and I'm sure we're just all watching very, very closely to kind of see what will happen. And there's multiple factors that are going to play into the future of Flagstaff values right now. But I guess, would you kind of wrap things up here too? Do you have any advice to agents, buyers, sellers from the appraiser standpoint?
I would say, you know, what I've just been seeing lately is, you know, kind of a rollback to, you know, not again like to say like that people care about appraising, but we're getting back into, you know, a little bit more thought going into the offers, concessions, repairs are back, you know, people having to cover repairs. Again, kind of an uptick in the FHA and making sure that the property is FHA conforming. Seeing that a lot more happening. So I think that it's kind of interesting to see, you know, just in terms of that, like for me, for my job, and what I'm seeing a lot of is, you know, now that there are more opportunities for some of those buyers that are going to be utilizing FHA, to come back into the market because now they can, just looking at those properties, making sure that those properties conform, making sure that you're, kind of likewise with the loan process, making sure, if you have certain properties, FHA manufactured homes, foundation certifications for the lenders, making sure you have all of that kind of up front. So that, the loan process just goes a little bit easier. The appraisal process goes a little bit easier. And so that's like one thing that I've been really seeing that's kind of interesting is kind of having this, the shift in the market and like who the buyers are in the market and what kind of properties that, we're having come up in the market, and kind of having to go back to our old ways of looking at things where now, it's not necessarily, an issue of value. It's making sure that, the houses conform and that would be the biggest thing that I'm kind of seeing on my plate right now. Is as these properties come up, just making sure that they kind of fall into the requirements.
Exactly. And as lending product is changing on them and just having an overall heads up.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for all you do for us in the industry. And guys, reach out to Jenna with questions.